Buonasera a tutti, oggi ci troviamo con Shelley McNamara dello studio di Grafton Architects. Ringraziamo tutti per essere qua ovviamente e come è dovuto anche il nostro sponsor, l'UDS, il centro, l'ED Centro di Shelley. Questa sera Shelley McNamara e purtroppo Yvonne Farley non è potuta venire, però comunque siamo molto contenti di avere Shelley con noi, soprattutto una profonda ammirazione per loro come studio, sia come metodo, come persone, e spero che possa tramandare questo suo modo sia di vedere l'architettura sia di insegnare in questa presentazione. E la ringrazio tantissimo per essere riuscita a venire con un calendario pazzesco, e ringrazio voi di nuovo per essere venuti e niente, Shelley, do la parola.
Okay. I'm just wondering if people would like to come in. It makes me nervous to see that you can't fit. Do you want to move in further, or do you want to be able to leave quickly? Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for the introduction. And it's lovely to be back in Mendrisio. Yvonne and I had some lovely times here, 2008, 2010. And it's nice to see some familiar faces. I said to Michelle that we couldn't say no to her invitation because of it's the Society's invitation. It's not just Michelle's, I know. But when we got by email the theme, Tradition and I, but not just the theme, but also the quote from T.S. Eliot from an essay which I had actually been reading, and I presume that all you guys have read it since you sent it as being the theme, or maybe you haven't. But it's an essay that I really love, tradition and the individual talent. And I knew when I read this that it was the same essay. And I just think it's a fantastically liberating piece of text for an architect or a poet or anybody in the creative sort of world, because of the way that Eliot describes the process of making art and describes the relationship of past and present. And of course Eliot is a master in terms of describing time and time past, time present. And I just to I suppose extend your theme or start by this theme, I was looking at it again on the way and remembering and noting down things that affected me when I first read it. Like he says, art never improves, but the material of art is never quite the same. Poetry is not the turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality, which is maybe not the way that we think about making architecture very often, because we think that it's about only us. But in a way, what's liberating about this essay, Tradition and the Individual, is that in a sense, it takes the heat off the individual. What in a sense, Eliot is proposing is that one connects with a force much bigger than the individual, and one connects with tradition, and that's what the making of art is. And just finally, just to put in context what I'm going to speak about, he says, the poet lives in what is not merely present, but the present moment of the past, conscious not of what is dead, but of what is already living. So it's because of this theme that you set that I'm here, because I think it's very serious, and I think it's very engaging, and I think it's very important questions that you as students are asking. I mean, it's amazing to think that we need to ask a question: is it contemporary to speak of tradition? That's a kind of a shocking question, in a sense, to think that one might have to ask it, because how could it not be contemporary to speak of tradition? But at the same time, it's very sobering and it's very important that you try to tease out this theme. There are other questions which I didn't realize were to do with an interview, but I used as a way of structuring the lecture, like where do you work? Is there something you've never achieved? When do you know you have a good idea? When do you finish a project? So I've woven those questions into the talk. So in terms of where we work in Dublin, obviously, and and it's nice to see a Dubliner, at least one in the audience. I think the thing about knowing and loving one city means that you learn how to see, and you learn to perhaps know and love and understand other cities. And even though Dublin is so familiar to us, it's a place that continually teaches us and reteaches us. I suppose this image, you could say, is kind of ordinary, but on the other hand, if you look at it as practicing architects, it's a street made probably by 10 different builders or 10 different architects, and you could say it's repetitive, but every building is different. Each room is full of light, and yet there's between 70 and 50% of the wall is solid. So how can the 18th century architects and builders make rooms that are full of light, but not all glass, for instance? Each room breathes through its chimney pot. Each house is defensive but welcoming. And there's so many lessons that one continually learns from one's own place. This book I love, 7 Winters, written by this woman, Elizabeth Bowen, who was what we call Anglo-Irish. But she's written this book, which is it's called A Dublin Childhood, because she spent 7 winters in the city and 7 summers in her country house, and she thought that that winter lived in the city and summer lived in the countryside. And it's a beautiful way of describing a city, because it's through the perceptions of a child. And the terms that she uses, not being an architect, I find very provocative, where she talks about streets being like an unbroken cliff. That the height of the houses made the human idea look to me superhuman. And there was something abstract about this idea, with its built-up planes of shadow and light. And talks about the fact that that the light is so red because of the brick of the city, that Dublin appeared to seal up sunshine as an unopened orange seals up juice. And there's something lovely about, I suppose, finding other ways of describing or thinking or understanding city, taking off our architects' hats and simply, in a sense, enjoying places as human beings. But I suppose the main reason for talking about this book is that on the one hand, there's the thing of, and I was speaking with the group before this, where we were talking about these issues of tradition and memory and all of this, and the baggage that one builds up as an architect from one's childhood is something that we often underestimate. There's so much emphasis in being maybe how do I describe, novel or expressive, or finding our place as individuals. But there's also the thing of calling on memory, and just to say that memories and the culture that we absorb are part of the stuff that fills our suitcases and that we use continually as architects. This is our office overlooking the city which we work in. It's a small studio, and parallel with the city, we come from, I suppose, the culture of living in Ireland, but there's the culture of the landscape and there's the culture of the city. And what we've been finding in recent times is that we don't really think of any difference between the landscape of the city and the landscape of the countryside. I mean, we're dealing with different kinds of landscape. And this image on the left of the west of Ireland, you could say it looks like a city plan, even though it's a karst limestone landscape in the west of Ireland. And just starting on our references, which you asked us to think about, the Sver Fen Pavilion, the right image, Sver Fen Pavilion in Venice, has, since the time we saw it, I suppose, has been like a stable conscience in our work. How little can you do? How much do you need to do? But I suppose this dual image is also to do with something that we continually research, which is how do we make a connection with the ground and how do we make a connection with the sky, and what is the space between? And the space between is very often the architecture. But the work of Sver Fen, in terms of reference points and stitching into a tradition, I suppose it's that thing of making everything with almost nothing, that he can make this enclosure of beams and trees and reflected light and express a culture and express a sensibility, and at the same time do it with such minimum means. Laurent Baudouin, a French architect, has written beautifully about the work of Sver Fen in I think it's in one of the introductions to A++U, and he in talking about this work, he says that the architecture of Sver Fen somehow shows that architecture can be a machine for slowing time down. And I think that's a really interesting description of he talks about the pace of the human being different to the pace of nature, that they're not in sync, and that architecture somehow slows time down to perhaps bring them more in relation to each other. And just looking at the heroic, what I call heroic landscapes, not just in Ireland, but an idea that we continually talk about is architecture as abstracted landscape. We were interested in the relationship between the structure of landscape, the structure of city, of blurring those boundaries between urban and rural, but also the idea that that architecture can actually be an abstraction of a landscape. I mean, even in terms of materials or connection with place, but also I suppose in terms of thinking about, I love that thing in architecture that you can make a landscape in an interior, or you can make an interior as part of a landscape. I mean, it's one of the amazing things about architecture is that scale doesn't matter. You can make something which has real presence, even if it's very small, and you can make a sense of interior even within a bigger world. And in terms of other reference points, and it's interesting to compare this image with the Sver Fen image. This is the work of Jensen Skudvin from the same country. And what's wonderful about their work, this is a road through a forest, which I'm sure you know as students, where these architects were asked to make certain tourist sites accessible, and made this road through the forest, but kept all the trees. So the cars slowed down, and the cars had to move around the trees, and then to protect the trees, they wrapped them in rope. And they talk a lot about addition and not subtraction. That as architects, that it's important to see that maybe one can think about this thing of maybe adding other layers, but not having to clear things away in order to make something. And there's that kind of subtlety of intervention which is really inspirational. And this work looks like nothing, but it's highly engineered in order to make a road which doesn't damage the roots of the trees, in order to make a safe, level place for cars to travel within a forest. It's highly engineered, but yet it keeps the character of the place. And just to go back to Eliot's thing about emotion, I just found this piece when Jan Olof Jensen came to Dublin, and Conor was probably there actually, and he used this phrase in Dublin many years ago when he came to Dublin. Just this thing about, I can't remember again what Elliot says, but it's something like that making poetry is not just about opening up your emotions. And Jan Olof Jensen says, mostly the Norwegian landscape is looked at in a romantic way, and it's thought of as something fantastic. I've been looking in Norwegian literature for a long time to find someone who is critical or unsentimental about the landscape, and I found this, quote, "I'm not able to get rest and feel at home in any landscape, and that is not the fault of humans. It is nature's fault. I cannot understand the poets. They will find any landscape beautiful and harmonic. There must be something seriously wrong with their minds. How is it possible for them to overlook all this chaos, this mess, this ugliness? Most disgusting are the deep valleys with rivers and forests in the bottom and steep cliff walls on either side. It gives me a headache and makes me want to puke." Ralph Stenerson, who I believe was a very cultivated person and collected Munch paintings and all of this kind of thing. But I suppose this just is by way of saying that as architects we have to obviously feel and understand how places feel, but we also have to be very incisive and unsentimental in the way that we look at things and try to read them, to read place and to read structures. That there's a way of learning to see, and if one learns to see, then one can make. We've spoken about this before, and I'm going to bore a lot of people who might have been students of ours and I had to force myself not to show Mangiarotti because our last group of students sent us this very funny postcard saying, "Please no more Mangiarotti," because we discovered Mangiarotti when we were working in Milan and just found him to be an amazing architect. Anyway, Lina Bo Bardi, this image which we found haunting, and sometimes you look at a certain image and you feel something in your brain clicking, and you know that something has happened and your perception has changed. And I found when we looked at images like this and the work of Villanova Artigas and all of those Sao Paulo architects, we found something that we had been unconsciously looking for. I'm not quite sure yet what it is, but just the thing that we found in this image was the clarity, and I suppose that thing of defying gravity. And maybe one of the reference points we think a lot about structure and how structure and space are absolutely interconnected. And in a sense, this image is very much to do with defying gravity, with, I suppose, having a sense of mass and at the same time having a sense of defying mass. And just to talk about themes or qualities that we look for in the work that we tried to make, and we don't see, I suppose, a difference between past and present in the sense of places and spaces and qualities that move you. I mean, we're interested in that thing of mass being borne down or being held up, and that one feels that, and that human beings enjoy moving in spaces where you feel like you're moving within the play of the forces of gravity. This is an undercroft of two bridges that meet in Toulouse, and it's just a beautiful conjunction of elements. I'm going to show one of the projects that I'm showing is our project in Toulouse, and this is the Jacobin cloister in Toulouse, and we just managed to capture this moment of the child standing in the sunlight in the spotlight, and it was a memorable moment for us in terms of registering the climate and the light, and also, I suppose, thinking about how when you visit a place like this, you think about how one can make space, whether one can make space through a series of layers of of garden, of cloister, of wall, of window, of volume, of node glass, of tempering climate through a series of layers, and not making or containing space in an abrupt way. The opposite to the wall. And again, one of the questions before this talk was, where do you start with a project? And in a sense, this is where we start. We start to say, well, do we need to make a wall, or do we need to make a layered space, or what kind of space are we trying to make? And this image of Santiago de Compostela I really love, because and Alvaro Siza has a beautiful description of this wall, which is the convent wall directly opposite the cathedral, and there's a big long seat which you can't see in this image, you'll see in the next image. And he says something like that it's a monotonous wall wavering somewhere between vibrancy and a magnetic presence. And in this essay that he has written on walls, he's almost angry, because he feels that this is nothing, but it's everything. And I suppose it raises this question of, again, as architects, how one sometimes needs to step aside and make a building that's in the background and that's not in the foreground. And for me, this wall describes that. And I just put this in because, as part of our reference and part of our development, 40 years ago, Yvonne came to Ticino and to see the work of Mario Botta of the Tower House and the Morbio Inferiore School and things like that, and brought this book back. And discovering that work and the work of Galfetti and Snozzi was hugely important. I'm jumping around the place in terms of references, but it's okay, I think. I'll make sense later. But that work was hugely important because it had that thing of connection with place, but it also had ideas of infrastructure and structure and connection with culture. And one of the things you asked us to talk about was something that we never managed to achieve. And this is the same wall in Santiago de Compostela, which is the wall with a big bench with the reflection of the cathedral on its surface, and this idea of making a building which would be a secondary element to something more primary and more important than you. And when we were making the Macintosh competition entry, this was our aspiration, to make something opposite the Macintosh building which would be almost nothing, which would have this wall which would reflect in the sunlight in the same way, would reflect the form of the Macintosh building, and would make a seat from which people could view the building. And we thought that was a beautiful idea, but we made a complete mess and didn't develop that. So again, that's one of the things that you asked. Are there things you've never managed to make? And that's one. But it is something that we're really interested in, to make something that's secondary to something that's already there and is primary to maybe your own project. This comes back. This is Oskar Kokoschka from the top floor of a building right beside the Berlin Wall, looking down on a city that he hasn't seen since the 20s, and is so shocked when he comes back. He's commissioned to make a painting just after the wall has gone up, and is so shocked to see the scarred city. And I suppose it comes back to this thing of city and architecture, and that when you see cities or buildings destroyed, that you realize that architecture and buildings and cities hold culture. And when they're destroyed, a component of culture is destroyed. And this is the city that has made us, or made our practice. And we've spent many years working in Dublin, stitching and I would say stitching and repairing blocks and working in back lanes, and I suppose without realizing it, following the proposition of Jensen Skudvin, thinking about addition rather than subtraction. And I think this way of building up a practice where you're literally always repairing something that's already there has affected the way that we look at ways of making new projects. A project we've done recently in Dublin overlooks this Huguenot cemetery, which is a secret sacred place in Dublin, right in the centre of the city. And we made a Department of Finance building, which is a public building, and I suppose it's our most public project in Dublin, and it's a time when we looked at this thing of making something which would have a sense of mass and a sense of presence, and we made it in limestone. In Dublin, the normal buildings, 18th century buildings, are brick, and the special public buildings are in stone, and so we made this building in stone. And our reference point for this was the Eileen Gray fantastic lacquered screen. And what we love about that screen on the left is that it's movable. It has weight, but we've always wanted to make, we've tried many times to make a wall which would have that sense of maybe being able to move, even though it might not move, and that it's almost dematerializing mass. And this was a collage study that we started this project with for the building in Dublin. And the other building that we went to see when we were making this project was this building in bank building in Stockholm by Celsing. And we were really shocked by the kind of enormous strength of this black piece of mountain, which seemed to find itself in the center of Stockholm. It starts off being very rough and becomes more and more refined, and is absolutely beautifully detailed, and we felt it was like a piece of geology right in the center of the city. And we were trying to make a wall which would have that kind of mass. And we made an office building where the circulation is on the edge and people work in the middle, so that there was an idea that the city was present, and that the civil servants and the city would always be in contact, and that we would make this kind of cloistered space which would have the rhythm of window solid, framing the view of the city, and making this kind of vertical weave of stone and glass, which would be like a kind of privacy screen overlooking the cemetery. And the recessed windows open and the projecting windows are fixed, so that your relationship with the wall and with the city changes as you move around the building. So this project was to do with paying homage to a secret important place in Dublin, and also making a public building which would have a sense of presence and of mass. In 2002, we won. On the left is a plan of Dublin, and on the right is the plan of Milan. And in 2002, we won a competition for the Bocconi University building in Milan. And I'm not going to describe it in detail, but I'm going to use it as a way of describing our way of work and our reference points. The university is just outside the Spanish walls, about 20 minutes walk from the Duomo, and I'm really sorry to have missed the Moretti exhibition, because Moretti was very important for us in this project. When we visited Milan, we found, I suppose we'd been before, but when you're making a competition, you view a city like a detective. Manuel de Sola Morales actually talks about that one has to really approach a city like a detective, and he talks about finding the clues in the wrinkles of the city. And I love the way Richard Sennett talks about cities as being flesh and stone. And we found on the roof of the Duomo a kind of an abstracted landscape. I suppose, going back to my earlier images, that it was like this kind of man-made stone mountain whooshed up in the air. And this model was made by Mendrisio students, and we really loved the way it was made, because it really somehow described that sense of a man-made landscape floating above the life of the city. And again, going back to the Sverfen roof and the limestone landscape of the west of Ireland, what we found in Milan was the fantastic floor of the city, and that had a real potency in terms of the way that we thought. And it felt like quite a hard city, quite defensive and hard to penetrate, not open and easy like so many other Italian cities. But yet when you went inside, you found this other secret world of courtyards and aviaries and wonderful delights. And our project was to build 60,000 square meters of building, but half of it was supposed to be below ground, and we really weren't sure how you could possibly put 30,000 square meters of building below ground. And we looked at Lalibela, these wonderful churches, underground churches in Ethiopia, where they're carved into the ground, and there's these fantastic ritualistic routes to get to these buried spaces. But of course we also looked at Khan and at Salk and how he made spaces below and above ground. And when you talk about in your list of things to think about key moments, this was a key moment for us. You know, when you find sometimes that you've got something that you can make, that you've got a starting point, and the bottom sketch for us was the starting point, that we could make this university by thinking, first of all, that we would eliminate this idea of boundary between below and above ground, that we would just eliminate this idea of datum, and that we would make two worlds. One would be the carved ground of the city, which would allow of the university, which would allow the city to enter into the world of the university, and the other would be almost like inhabited Sverfen louvers, that we would make this skyscape or this roofscape through which light could come. And we were literally thinking like that because this was huge. We hadn't a clue what to do. It was more than 10 times bigger than anything we'd ever done before, and we had to do it in 3 months or something. So you hit the ground kind of running. And so we thought about carved landscape, and we thought about a light filter which would allow the offices of the professors to exist, the conference facilities below ground, and that somehow by holding these two worlds apart, that the life of the city would enter into the life of the university. And as I say, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but just to say that the stone floor of Milano is taken through the building to try to bring the city through into the project, and our very early models of really struggling, trying to see how we could convert this idea into a project. This thing of trying to find a scale or a rhythm. And it goes back to Lina Bobardi and Villanova Artigas, this work which we actually discovered just before we were invited to do this competition. And there's an infrastructural component in that work which really liberated us. And so we thought about this not as a building but a piece of urban infrastructure, almost like a piece of engineering that one could inhabit. And the idea of holding these two worlds apart and being able to manipulate the soffit of one and the roof of the other, that we would make this rich world between the two. When it came to thinking about what kind of building we would make in Milano, we had the highly rational tradition of Pagano and Muzio already on the Bocconi site, and we were torn between that and the more expressive elemental work of Moretti. And nearby on Corso Italia was this project, which really gave us the nerve. And to the bottom right is a very crude collage of ours where we were trying to make the section into the expression of the project. And this came after a very long struggle of trying to see whether we should cloak this section of the auditorium stitching up into the office space, or whether we should let the project out of the box in a sense. And we let it out of the box and I suppose took the idea of the auditorium as the anchor for the project, and thought about it as erupting out of the ground of the city and drawing the life of the city down into the depths of the ground. And we also thought about this auditorium stitching up into the world of the professors to make these periscopes which would light this large conference space for 1,000 people. And the structure, which is the infrastructure, is actually the primary circulation spaces, where we have the corridors at a frequency of 25 meters, and they support beams which allow us to hang the offices. And we had won the competition maybe about 2 weeks, and the client said, "What kind of stone do you want to use?" And we thought, "Oh my God, we haven't a clue." But we did see this lovely stone on Via Brera, and they said, "But that's really ordinary, cheap stone. It's called Ceppo." And we said, "Yeah, but it's very nice." And they said, "Okay, tomorrow you'll go to the quarry." And we went to the quarry, and we found this amazing image of the quarry and the stone, which was so like the way the buildings are made in Milano, this kind of monolithic solid kind of mass, and our model to the left of what we were trying to do using this stone, and how the sketch developed into a project. And all the time moving between sketches and working drawings. The bottom sketch is about trying to get the sense of Milano, of the hard exterior, and the upper sketch was the idea of trying to make a much more much lighter, open interior, so that we would keep the contrast between the world of the city and the world of the interior courtyards. And the way that Ceppo is used in Milano is the way that we used it on this building, where it's fixed directly to the concrete. And so the joints are tiny, and it has this monolithic quality. And Yvonne called the stone geological concrete, because it feels like concrete. And actually a lot of people, when it was open first, thought it was made of concrete. And it was a fantastic material to use. And I suppose, again, the making of architecture, we often talk about it's a combination of precise judgments and random judgments. Like sometimes you ask very quickly to make a decision, and maybe in the way that Eliot talks about the poet needing to be a medium for poetry, that architects, we need to develop our senses, so that when we have to make decisions, that our senses are finely tuned and that we can make the right judgments. Approaching Bocconi from one side, we're always amazed that it's almost not there. It's like a kind of mirage. And then when you approach it from the other side, it for sure is there, and makes this corner and represents the presence of Bocconi University to the city. This image we love because one of our team played the cello on the roof of the Aula Magna, and I suppose it feels like a kind of a mountain, in the way that Elizabeth Bowen describes the streets of Dublin being like a cliff. We feel that it feels like a kind of a carved mountain or something. And the secondary street to Via Röntgen we made from the meeting rooms and the libraries, because it was the loosest element in the project, and we could make a loose kind of wall, but it was all within this idea of making a kind of a dam or an enclosure, and that this solid mass would hover above the streets, but that is like the lock gates would open, and that at ground floor level that the life of the city could flow into the world of the university. There's also the whole idea of delayed entry, and of making this public space which reached to Viale Blini, which was the most public street, and that you can look down into the foyer as you enter in this crevice or crack between the meeting rooms and the main body of the building, so that you penetrate what feels like a solid mass in order to come into the interior world. And then the thing of drawing light deep down into the space, and how the world of the city starts to enter into the world of the university. At certain times of the evening is wonderful, because that window disappears, and the city becomes more and more present in the interior world of the space. And I suppose in terms of this thing of structure and space and architecture, and that sense of which is ancient, of that sense of there's in the bridges in Toulouse, you get a sense of timelessness when you're walking under certain structures, where you feel the structure, you feel a certain connection with the world and with the earth. And that relationship of structure and architecture is so primal, and there's kind of a primal component in a potential in that connection between structure and space. And again, this thing of obvious reference to Lina Bobardi of weight being borne up and suspended above you, and the cutting into the ground to make large-scale staircases, or the hanging of staircases in space, which is the professor's staircase, which has a different idea, and then the different moods of buildings, which is always a pleasure to watch, where it's being used as a place of celebration and a piece of social infrastructure, or where it's a place to stand alone. One of the things we found about this strategic way of thinking was that one of the surprises was the diagonal sense. And I was just looking at the exhibition, fantastic exhibition that you have of photographs today, and how wonderful Katsura is, where there's so much is to do with the diagonal, and we really found this fantastic discovery of diagonal spaces in section, because the spaces aren't composed. In a sense, they're the result of a strategic way of thinking, and also, of course, how light can be drawn down deep into 5 meters below ground and 9 meters below ground. But one of the things that we got these photographs one Christmas from some of the professors who had a party in the space, and we really loved it because it somehow described one of the initial ideas that somebody coming home in the tram might see what was happening in the foyer space of the university. So they had their Christmas party, and also what we liked is that it made economists dance, and we thought that wasn't a bad result, that they would think about using this space in this way. The next project I want to talk about is it's another school of economics that we're doing in Toulouse, and in a sense, working in Toulouse was you could say almost the opposite to Milano. In Milano we felt familiar with the I suppose everything we know about cities we learned from the tradition of the Italian city, in a sense, and there was a rational, strategic approach to a way of making a project in Milan. But when we came to Toulouse, this wonderful, picturesque, beautiful medieval city, we really didn't know where to start, and in a sense we started to piece together a possible strategy, looking at the tiny courtyards of Toulouse, which frame the sky in a very particular kind of way, where you're in a space and the main elevation is the sky, and we really enjoyed that. Or again, going back to this bridge of how buildings sit so solid on the ground because you're in a city with a big river which floods, and going to these amazing interior spaces, the Jacobin, which actually we found incredibly moving as a space, and still haven't been quite able to articulate exactly why, but we've often talked about this space. Daniel Barenboim, whom I love to read in the way that he talks about music, he talks about the nature of music being inexpressible except through sound, and when I saw this space, it made me feel that the nature of architecture is inexpressible except through space. And sometimes you come to a space and it just really makes you stop in your tracks and think and realize that architecture is a language, and it speaks not just to us as architects, but it's a language that speaks. And this image reminds me of Louis Kahn, where he talks about, I think he says something like, it's the structure that makes the light, and when he makes a column, he thinks about light, no light, light, no light, and that kind of rhythm of light, dark, and which is also a beautiful idea. I think he also says somewhere that when he hears a sound or when he hears music, he thinks about space and talks about the tonality of space. And maybe as architects we don't think about that enough, about when we start to make spaces, what it's going to sound like, or how the light can wash over you. And again, because you asked us, how do you know, or how do you start, or how do you, what do you do? I just put together these sketches of our starting points, thinking about an educational building and how important in education, how you move through a building, how there's an easy way of connecting and overlapping. And Yvonne was making sketches of the buttresses in Toulouse, and we were trying to think, well, could we make a building out of buttresses? And I really thought she'd lost it when she started drawing the sunflowers, which were all over the place between Carcassonne and Toulouse, and sometimes you think your partner is maybe not such a great partner, but when she starts going on about sunflowers, and I just think, oh God, this is going to be tough. But anyway, that's where it started. And we started with this idea of, on the top left, of making something really solid because it's so hot. And the clients were continually going on about, we want a building that's cool, and we can't work, and we're economists, and we have to think, and in fact, one of the projects we were looking at was Castel del Monte, which is fantastic building in Puglia, and just making a solid wall. But we realized, educationally and in terms of the nature of the city, the university was looking for something much more open and loose. So the top right-hand image, we knew we'd never win the competition because it was so stiff and tight and rigid. We started getting somewhere on the bottom right image because the university wanted a loose arrangement of spaces, and then the bottom left we, I suppose, started getting somewhere. But effectively what we found was that the city was like a gravitational pull on the project. We had to make something which would open up to the city. And so we had this idea about stacking the orange rooms, which are all the common conference rooms, that we would stack those vertically, and that we would make, and we're also situated beside a medieval wall, right smack bang on a medieval wall, so we had to think about this. And I suppose the key moment was this sketch when we thought about stacking the orange common rooms to relate to the river and to the canal, and that we would prize those rooms apart and make big windows at the scale of the city through which the professors could view Toulouse. We couldn't translate this section into a plan, and we had real difficulty in doing this, and we found that the buttresses really helped us, the buttresses of Toulouse. And so we thought about, in the top left plan, about making 6 buttresses, which would make the nostrils of the building, that all the air and the vertical ducts would be housed in those buttresses, and also all the escape stairs. So it's like we had to stake out the territory in a way which is maybe similar to the way that buildings traditionally stake out territory in Toulouse. And it also gave us a way of establishing mass and establishing edges, and then being able to carve and let the life of the city and the university flow freely between these, what we call buttresses. And that led to this study model, where again we set up these 6 legs, which are the order of the project, and then allowed to the space of the city. I suppose we thought about the building inhaling and exhaling, that it was kind of breathing in and breathing out, that there would be that reciprocal connection between the university and the city. And we used, because it's a centralized plan, there's this fantastic column which you couldn't put your arms around, Saint-Étienne, wonderful space where there are all these, because it's a conglomerate of different spaces built at different periods, we felt that this big column was the anchor. And so we made the staircase and lift as the anchor to this building, where the spaces rotate and spin and act as a kind of a pinwheel in terms of its connection with the city. What you're looking at is the forecourt space where we made this what we call a sky cloister, which connects the professor's the president's office to the professor's meeting room and lounge. And even though it's not a hierarchical structure, we have this idea about connecting across the space, connecting down through fire staircases, making these cloisters, maybe connecting up again, so that behind these buttresses there's a secret world of connection which is both utilitarian but also architectural. And this sky cloister meant that we could make the space which frames the sky, which is like the courtyards that we had visited, where the main elevation would be that thing of the trapping of the sky. So that makes the threshold space between the city and the interior world of the university. So on the one hand you could say it's a collage of elements that we found, but on the other hand it's a very rigorous, rational kind of brief where we had to deal with highly repetitive elements of offices and special rooms which were the conference rooms. Our neighbour is this Romanesque brick, solid, fantastic wall. And I suppose again, when you're working in a place, you have, well, I don't mean you have to, but you feel a need to make something that feels like it's connected, but also feels that it's actually that reminds me, Kenneth Frampton makes the case that there's no significant innovation without tradition, and there's no living tradition without innovation. And I think that's very interesting in the context of the Eliot thing, as T.S. Eliot thing as well, that the tradition dies if it's not renewed, and innovation is meaningless if it doesn't connect. So we're trying to connect. The site is at the prow of the university, where the Brienne Canal, this is a branch of the Midi Canal, meets the Garonne River, which is a fantastic, huge river. And this is our site, which is a really difficult shape. There's a break in the medieval wall, which is no joke, to take your place beside a brick medieval wall 5 meters high, and really not knowing how to address that. I suppose, again, going back to Santiago de Compostela, of background and foreground, we pushed as much accommodation as we could to the background, so that we could make something which would feel more comfortable in the foreground. And sometimes that's maybe relevant and sometimes not, but it was particularly relevant here, this thing of thinking about some components as being background and some foreground. And so you see the central courtyard space. This is the sky cloister happens here. These are the buttresses full of services, full of staircases, working not just architecturally but in terms of the way the building functions. And placing sorry, just to go back, the conference rooms, cafes, and all these conference rooms are stacked, and between the conference rooms we make these terraces where they're used for amenity, but they also make a big window to the city, so that when the professors are where we are, that they're moving around their offices, that they can always view through these windows, where we prized the public rooms apart in order to make these windows to the city. And because we pulled all the escape stairs to the edge, we can move very freely in this central courtyard space. Their central foyer space is external, and that was again one of the things we loved about Toulouse, is that so many staircases that we walked in, you come through a gate, you're protected from the wind and the rain, but you're still outside. So that moment of between, where you actually open a door into a tempered room is delayed, and so we've taken advantage of that climate to do that here. I think this drawing maybe describes this idea of an interior landscape connecting with an external landscape, where we're trying to draw the strata of the interior world in the same way as you might draw the contours of a landscape. And this section is through the threshold space, which is a gentle ramp. The sky cloister encloses this forecourt, and you come into this foyer space, which is outside but is controlled in terms of wind and rain. And then from there you circulate to the research offices. In terms of how the building sits in the landscape of the city, Toulouse has all these strata of river, of huge brick walls which support the streets and the boulevards, and then the walls of the churches and the skyline. And these are early sketch of how we could occupy that skyline, and we use this tourist postcard as part of our competition entry to test how our 6 feet might sit into the landscape of the city. One of the, again, I suppose going back to Manuel de Sola Morales, he talks about looking at a city and not making any difference between the centimetre and the kilometre. And I love that you focus on something really small which can inform a big decision, or vice versa. And here we've been looking at brick for months. This is, on the left is the medieval wall, which has been repaired and re-repaired, and the walls of Toulouse and how they retain these boulevards hovering over this big river. And 1 hour outside of Toulouse, we discovered this brick factory, which is where they tell us they make bricks exactly the same as in the Roman times and exactly the same size. 42 millimeters by 26 millimeters by either 40 millimeters high or 50 millimeters high. But you can also get any shape of brick you want. And so it was like going to a brick bakery. And we're mixing traditional and contemporary engineering, because all those fire escape walls that I speak about, those buttress walls, they have to work in terms of smoke extract. And so we've pulled the bricks apart to allow us to get adequate ventilation and extraction of smoke, working with all the French really strict regulations and codes of practice. So we use their donut bricks, and we have secret reinforcement inside the donut bricks to make these aerated walls. And we're using the same color pointing and texture as the medieval wall. And we had a lot of arguments about how our buildings should touch the ground. And when we went back and looked at Albi, which Louis Kahn looked at, as well as Toulouse, and when you look at these photographs, and if you look again at My Architect, that film, you'll see, when I saw it recently, I could see Albi in Louis Kahn's buildings in that film, because this is an amazing fortified church in Albi, which is a piece of engineering, piece of architecture, but it sits in such an uncompromising way, so solid on the ground, that that's something that we really have worked on to give our building in Toulouse that sense of presence. I'm just going to finish with a competition we've just won in Lima in Peru, and I'm not going to show it in any comprehensive way. We discovered the work of Vilanova Artigas in about the year 2000, and as I mentioned earlier, that really helped us in making the work in the project in Milan. And I don't think we would have done the competition in Peru if we weren't already familiar with this work and hadn't already been hugely affected by this work, which is in Brazil, but it's the same continent, and we somehow, I suppose, made this kind of connection in terms of that kind of tradition. But what I find so stunning about this project is that it's engineering and landscape and architecture and everything just all mixed up. And somehow Vilanova Artigas can make a house feel like a piece of infrastructure, and can make a piece of infrastructure feel like a house. And I think there's something amazing about that. And and this is Villanueva. I mean, the other thing that we found amazing about these images is you could not tell where outside stopped and where inside started. We were a bit worried about the arrogance maybe of thinking about making a project in such a completely different place. But sorry. I was reading recently about Brazilian architects talking about cultural exchange and cultural overlap, and they use the the metaphor of cultural cannibalism, which I thought was kind of interesting. And seemingly there's some story in the 16th century, a Catholic priest was eaten by a tribe of cannibals in Brazil, and there was a huge scandal, but the Brazilians made the case that they would only have eaten him because they respected him. And if they hadn't respected him, they wouldn't have eaten him. And I thought that, and they're saying the same about culture, that cultural exchange is paying homage and absorbing and making new identities and new languages. And I suppose that was kind of reassuring. Lima, our site is in this finger of a valley which connects back from the sea. It's an extraordinary city where you have the sea, you have a 40-meter cliff separating the city from the sea, and then you have a couple of valleys which connect in from the sea to the city, and our site is on one of them. The image on the right, bottom right, is effectively what you would see from our site, but it's a foggy city. When you're down by the sea and you look up, sometimes the city is there and sometimes it's gone. It's completely gone. There's only fog. We thought there was fog in Milan until we went to Lima, and it's Lima, you know, there's no fog in Milan, relatively speaking. This was a sketch that Yvonne did, which I suppose, again, when you're doing a competition particularly, you can spend so long arguing, and it's always very tense because, you know, everything is compressed in terms of time, and this site is beside a motorway. It's incredibly tough site. On the one side there's this huge alienating kind of separating motorway, and on the other side is this really lovely leafy high density low rise housing, a district called Barranco. And our project was between these two extremes of leafy, small-scale residential, huge motorway. And Yvonne made this sketch of making the building feel like an arena of learning. That it's almost like we were looking at a project from a long time ago in London by Niamh Brown, who was he wasn't a teacher of ours, but some of Grafton Architects worked with him, where he made a project beside a railway line, a housing project, and made a structure like this where the terraces backed onto the railway. So we were thinking about that, but we were also thinking about football stadiums, of Soto de Moro, of Villanova Artigas, of Mendes de Rocha, just mixing infrastructure and I suppose because of the nature of the site, again thinking about a university in a very particular kind of way. And so we made this project where the idea was that we would on the one side have these stepped terraces, which would be like the scale of Barranco would probably be this size, and it's almost as if we peeled Barranco up and carved out the undercroft to make this big space at the scale of the city, from which the students would have a visual connection with the city, not a physical one, because it's not possible, because it's because of the motorway, and that we would ground the project with the conference facilities, which would make this kind of heavy groundwork, and out of that would come this structure which has to work from a seismic point of view. And just looking at the plans with the motorway to the top of the page and the residential quarter to the bottom of the page, and not unlike, I suppose, Milano in some ways in terms of thinking about structure and strategy, but with a very different, I suppose, set of conditions here in terms of those two extremes of motorway on the one side, and this is our project in the context of the scale of the city. It's 280 meters long. It connects down this valley to the sea, and as I say, we wanted to make the public space overlooking the city, and then the learning spaces more intimate, relating to the residential quarter. There's also the thing of water in in Lima that they have 9 millimeters of water a year, so there's a huge problem. And these sketches were to do with trying to trap water when they have these floods, which they call El Nino, but also designing the whole structure and the bracing of the structure in such a way that water collection tanks and water holding tanks would be integrated into the structural bracing system and into the whole idea of really making a new landscape. And there are these, we haven't managed to go and see these structures yet, but they're amazing in Lima, where these sacred places are these man-made burial places, man-made ground and strata and terraces made from the earth. And because it was foggy, there was this idea that the building would merge with the sky, that it would rise from the ground, being really solid towards the motorway, and rise up and merge with the sky, and that it would connect with which so many of the buildings in Lima do, connect with the color of the earth, and that we would use the concrete, which would use the aggregate or the mix in the concrete, which would in some way connect with this idea of the cliff. And in the way that Villanova Artigas work somehow allows landscape to flow. And Mendes de Rocha, we've been looking recently at the football stadium of Mendes de Rocha, and it's amazing how tiny cracks in the structure allow a landscape to develop. And so there's this kind of humanizing thing of landscape, integration of landscape and structure. And the gardens which the students would enjoy, which relate to the teaching spaces and also overlook the city, but would make a quieter, more contemplative zone. And looking at our sketch model, this thing of making these kind of artificial man-made terraces which are hung from this large-scale structure, and making a really perfect space which would be conducive to urban life and also to the life of the students, and really trying to learn from or think about those Villanueva images and the warmth of the light, and how we could make that, really use that, the thing of climate, which would allow us to make very open, easy spaces. One of the things the client really loved was that it's an engineering school, and the main element, I suppose the most important element for them, are these big, tough, dirty laboratories. And we just felt that they should be the heart of the project and be part of the social life of the project. And so they're almost like exhibition spaces, and that everybody, like in Toulouse, everybody moves to the buttresses to escape. Everybody moves to the side of the motorway to both to circulate, but also in terms of, because there's this huge issue in places like Lima where there's panic to do with earthquakes as well as to do with fires. So the whole thing of escape and safety is crucially important. I'm just ending with this image. On the left is Skellig Michael, which is a monastic settlement in Ireland. On the right is Machu Picchu. And I suppose it's to do with this thing of cultural exchange or overlap, or what's universal, what's local, all of those things. And for me, what these two images describe is something that William Curtis speaks very beautifully about in relation to Machu Picchu, where he talks about platform and horizon, and he talks about the intimacy of the place that's made in terms of the appropriated space, and then the huge big horizon, and that the middle ground disappears. And that's something, I suppose, that we unconsciously found ourselves dealing with in this competition, because of the nature of the site, is that we needed to make spaces which were intimate, but at the same time we needed to enjoy the bigness of the horizon of the city. And what's really moving when one visits Skellig Michael, the monastic settlement, they're really perching on the side of a cliff in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, is that you find that there are remnants of gardens, of herb gardens, and of domesticity and shelter and protection and comfort in the context of this really kind of rugged landscape. And so it's really just to make this point about intimacy and horizon, or platform and horizon. Thank you.